I'm not part of this family anymore. The words hung in the air of my living room like smoke. My brother Alan's face turned the same shade of red it did when we were kids, and he didn't get his way. My father, once imposing but now shrunken in his tailored suit, blinked rapidly. For the first time in my 36 years, I'd rendered Franklin Porter speechless. "Maggie, be reasonable," Alan finally said, leaning forward on my cream sofa, the one I'd saved 6 months to buy. "Dad's in serious trouble here." I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the bitter warmth and the moment. "So I gathered from your 15 desperate voicemails." My father cleared his throat. "Margaret, this is hardly the time for..." "For what, Dad? Honesty? Because that's all I'm offering. I stopped being part of this family the day Mom died, and you decided I wasn't worth the same consideration as Golden Boy over here." I nodded toward Alan. Alan ran his hand through his salt and pepper hair, still thick, unlike his moral fiber. "This is about the company, Maggie. The feds are sniffing around Dad's financials. If this goes south, Porter Construction is done. 20 years of building this business gone." 35, my father corrected automatically. Always precise about his accomplishments, never about his failures. "And why exactly would the FBI be investigating you?" I asked, already knowing the answer. The Porter family business had always operated in the gray, cutting corners, greasing palms. Nothing outright illegal, or so we all pretended. My father tugged at his collar. "A misunderstanding about some contracts in Millfield. Government contracts. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Your husband could help sort this out. Daniel's reputation at the DA's office." "Ex-husband," I corrected. "And Daniel left the DA's office 3 years ago. But you wouldn't know that, would you? Since you haven't bothered to call or visit since the divorce." The truth was Daniel and I were still on good terms. He'd gone private practice, specializing in white-collar defense, and had built a reputation for keeping clients out of prison, exactly what my father needed. But they didn't need to know that. Alan leaned back, his designer watch catching the afternoon light streaming through my modest windows. "Dad paid for your college, Maggie, and helped with the down payment on your first house, while paying for both of your kids' private school tuitions, their college funds, their cars, their legal troubles." I set my mug down with a deliberate clink. "When Caleb wrapped his Porsche around that oak tree and nearly killed his girlfriend, who paid off her family. When Ashley got caught with coke at Wellesley, who made it disappear. It wasn't their paper route money." My father's jaw clenched. "Family takes care of family." Exactly my point. I was never family enough. I stood up. "Now if you'll excuse me, I have a shift at the hospital in an hour." Alan's eyebrows shot up. "You're still working as a nurse?" I thought that was just a phase. 14 years is a hell of a phase, Alan. My father rose shakily, his age suddenly visible in the stoop of his shoulders. "Margaret, please." I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. For a moment, I felt a twinge of the old need to please him, the little girl desperate for Daddy's approval. I squashed it down. "I'll think about it," I lied. "Now I really do have to get ready." After they left, I sat back down, hands trembling slightly. I'd dreamed of telling them off for years, but the reality left me hollow. My phone buzzed with a text from Diane, my closest friend since nursing school. "How'd it go with the family vultures?" I typed back. "They need a favor." I said no. Diane's response was immediate. "Holy shit, she grows a backbone. Drinks to celebrate? Can't. Work. Tomorrow?" I set the phone down and walked to my bedroom to change into scrubs. As I pulled my hair back into a ponytail, I caught sight of the small framed photo on my dresser, me and Mom, 6 months before the cancer took her. She was already thin, but smiling, her arm around my shoulders as we stood in front of the lake house in Palmer Cove. "You should have seen me stand up to them, Mom," I whispered. Finally. But standing up to them wasn't enough. Not after everything. The investigation into Porter Construction made the local news 3 days later. I watched from the nurse's station as the reporter stood outside the company headquarters in downtown Riverbrook. Sources say federal investigators are looking into allegations of bid rigging and kickbacks related to several government contracts awarded to Porter Construction over the past 5 years. Jolene, the charge nurse, glanced at the screen. Hey, isn't it your family's company? Used to be, I said, turning back to my charting. My phone lit up with another call from Alan. 7th one today. I declined it and finished documenting my patient's vitals. The truth was, I knew exactly what the feds were investigating. 3 weeks ago, I'd had lunch with Daniel to sign the last of our divorce papers, the final step in our amicable but necessary separation. Over paninis, he'd mentioned a case he'd turned down. Porter Construction, he'd said. Your father's company. They approached me about some potential legal trouble. I nearly choked on my sandwich. And you said no? Daniel had shrugged. Conflict of interest. You're my ex-wife, but I still care about you. And from what you've told me about your father, he'd left the sentence hanging. What kind of trouble? I'd asked. Can't say specifically, but it involves federal contracts, falsified bids, kickbacks. Serious stuff, Mags. I'd pushed my plate away, appetite gone. Why are you telling me this? His dark eyes had softened. Because I know how they treated you. How they cut you out after we split. I thought you should know they might try to drag you back in when things get desperate. Daniel had always been perceptive. It was one of the things I'd loved about him, even as our marriage crumbled under the weight of his 70-hour workweeks and my night shifts. Now, as I finished my charting and headed to check on Mrs. Abernathy in 412, I wondered if I should call him. Not for my father's sake, but to understand exactly what kind of trouble the Porter men had gotten themselves into. My phone buzzed again as I was taking Mrs. Abernathy's blood pressure. A text from an unknown number. Margaret, this is your father. Alan gave me your new number. We need to talk. My attorney says this is worse than we thought. Please call. I deleted the message and smiled at my patient. Your pressure's looking good today, Mrs. A. How's the pain? Better, honey. That new medication is doing the trick. She patted my hand. You look troubled. Everything okay? Just family drama, I said. Nothing I can't handle. Family's complicated, she said with the wisdom of her 86 years. But they're all we've got in the end. I thought of the Porter family dinners I'd been excluded from after my divorce. The birthdays and Christmases where I wasn't welcome because I'd chosen nursing over a real career and then failed at my marriage. Not all families are worth keeping, I said quietly. Later that night, I called Daniel. He answered on the second ring.
Maggie.
I was wondering when I'd hear from you. They came to see me, I said without preamble, asking for your help.
He sighed.
I figured they might. What did you tell them? To get lost, essentially. A low chuckle. That's my girl. Well, not my girl anymore, but you know what I mean. I smiled despite myself. Daniel had always been able to lighten my darkest moods. How bad is it for them? Really? Bad, he said, his voice turning serious. The evidence is solid. Your father signed off on falsified documents. Your brother managed the kickbacks. He was sloppy about it too. Paper trails everywhere. I closed my eyes. And now they want you to make it disappear. No one can make this disappear, Maggie. Best case scenario with a good attorney? Your father pleads guilty to lesser charges, does maybe a year in a minimum security facility, pays hefty fines. Your brother might walk with probation if he cooperates. And if they don't get a good attorney? 5 to 10 for your father. 2 to 3 for Alan. Asset seizure. The company gone. Their personal accounts frozen. I should have felt something, satisfaction, maybe, or regret. Instead, I felt oddly empty. Why are you telling me all this? Attorney-client privilege. They're not my clients, Maggie. I turned them down, remember? I'm telling you, because I know them. They'll try to use you to get to me, and I want you to be prepared. After we hung up, I sat on my small balcony, overlooking the quiet street. The summer night was thick with humidity, fireflies blinking in the darkness. In the distance, I could see the silhouette of downtown Riverbrook, where the Porter Construction headquarters stood 20 stories tall, my father's legacy in steel and glass. I thought of the day Mom died, how my father had retreated into himself and his work, how Alan had become the sole recipient of what little attention Dad had left to give. I thought of my nursing school graduation, which neither of them attended because it coincided with a groundbreaking ceremony for a new Porter project. I thought of my wedding day, how my father had walked me down the aisle but spent the reception networking with Daniel's legal colleagues. And I thought of what they'd do to me now if I didn't help them. They'd destroy me. They'd find a way, unless I got to them first. The Porter family estate sat on 5 acres in the wealthier part of Riverbrook, a sprawling colonial with white columns and perfectly manicured lawns. I punched in the gate code, still the year of my father's birth, his ego requiring that daily recognition, and drove my sensible Honda up the long driveway. Alan's BMW and my father's Mercedes were parked in front, along with a sleek black Audi I didn't recognize. Their new lawyer, probably. Some poor sucker who didn't know better. The housekeeper, Rita, answered the door. Her eyes widened at the sight of me. Miss Margaret. It's been years. I gave her a genuine smile. Rita had been more motherly to me than anyone after Mom died.
Hello, Rita.
Are they in the study? She nodded, her expression turning serious. They're with Mr. Caldwell. There's been a lot of shouting. I bet there has. I squeezed her hand and made my way through the familiar halls. The study door was closed. I could hear raised voices inside. I knocked once and entered without waiting for a response. 3 men looked up in surprise. My father behind his massive desk, Alan pacing by the window, and a thin man with silver hair and an expensive suit sitting in one of the leather chairs. Margaret, my father said, recovering first. You came. I did. I closed the door behind me. I thought about what you said. About family. Relief washed over Alan's face. Thank God. We need Daniel's help, Mags. It's worse than we thought. The silver-haired man stood, extending his hand. Theodore Caldwell, your father's attorney. I shook it briefly.
Margaret Porter.
And actually, it's Margaret Wilson now. I kept Daniel's name after the divorce. Speaking of Daniel, my father interjected, we need to talk to him immediately. Ted here has been doing his best, but we need someone with Daniel's connections. I sat down in the empty chair. And what makes you think Daniel will help you? Alan stopped pacing. Because you'll ask him to. He still cares about you, doesn't he? And there it was. The real reason they'd suddenly remembered I existed. He might, I said carefully. But why would I ask him? My father leaned forward. Because despite our differences, we're family. And the FBI is threatening everything I've built. Everything that would have been yours and Alan's someday. I didn't bother pointing out that the yours part of that statement had never seemed to be in his plans. Instead, I nodded thoughtfully. I see. And what exactly happened with these government contracts? Alan and my father exchanged looks. Caldwell cleared his throat. Perhaps we shouldn't discuss specifics. If you want my help, I need to know what I'm asking Daniel to get involved with, I said firmly. My father sighed, the weight of his 70 years showing in the slump of his shoulders. It was just business, Margaret. The way things are done. You grease the right wheels, you get the contracts. Everyone does it. But not everyone gets caught, I said. Alan shot me a sharp look. Are you going to help us or not? I let the question hang in the air for a moment. I'll talk to Daniel. But I want something in return. My father's eyebrows rose slightly. What? The lake house in Palmer Cove. I want to put in my name before I make that call. Alan scoffed. You can't be serious. That property is worth. I know exactly what it's worth. I cut him off. It's the only place where I have good memories of this family. Of Mom. And if you're really facing asset seizure, it'll be gone anyway. My father studied me for a long moment. You've changed, Margaret. I've grown up, I corrected. Do we have a deal? He nodded slowly. Ted can draw up the papers today. I'll need them signed and notarized before I call Daniel. Alan threw up his hands. This is ridiculous. We don't have time for this. Make time, I said, standing. I'll be back tomorrow to sign the papers. Then I'll call Daniel. As I turned to leave, my father spoke again. The family needs you, Margaret. After all we've done for you. Save it, I said, not turning around. I'll be here at noon tomorrow. Walking out of that house felt like shedding a skin I'd outgrown years ago. In my car, I called Daniel. They took the bait, I told him. They're transferring the lake house to me tomorrow. And they believe you'll help them? People tend to believe what they want to believe, I said. Especially desperate people. What's the next step? He asked. I started my car. I need you to make a few calls. The next day, I arrived at the estate precisely at noon, dressed in a simple black dress and low heels, funeral attire, though they wouldn't realize the symbolism until later. Rita let me in with a worried smile. The tension in the house was palpable. In the dining room, my father and Alan sat with Caldwell and a woman I didn't recognize, the notary, I assumed. Spread across the polished mahogany table were documents. The transfer papers for the lake house, my father said without preamble. As promised. I sat down and took my time reading through each page, feeling their impatience grow. Finally, I nodded and signed where indicated. The notary stamped each signature. Satisfied? Alan asked, his voice tight. Almost. I took out my phone and pulled up the camera. I need pictures of these for my records. Is that really necessary? Caldwell asked. Absolutely. I photographed each page methodically. When I was done, I put my phone away and looked at my father. I'll call Daniel now. He nodded, relief evident in his face. I stepped into the hallway for privacy and dialed. After a brief conversation, I returned to the dining room.
He'll meet with you, I said.
But just my father and Alan.
No lo digas.
Caldwell started to protest, but my father waved him off. Where and when? His office. 4:00 today. After they thanked me profusely, the first genuine gratitude I'd received from them in decades, I drove straight to Daniel's office. His secretary waved me through to his corner space with its view of the Riverbrook skyline. They're coming at 4, I told him. Everything else is set. He nodded, gesturing to the recording equipment discreetly positioned around his office. The FBI agent will be monitoring from next door. As long as you can get them to talk freely. They will, I said. You've seen the contracts they signed this morning? I have. The lake house is legally yours now, no matter what happens next. I sank into one of his client chairs. Do you think I'm doing the right thing? Daniel came around his desk and took the chair beside me, our knees almost touching. Maggie, they broke the law. Repeatedly. And they've hurt you for years. This isn't just about revenge, it's about justice. Still, they're my family. He took my hand. Family doesn't treat people the way they've treated you. You gave them a chance today to do the right thing, to come clean. Instead, they're trying to manipulate you into helping them escape consequences. I squeezed his hand before letting go. You're right. Let's do this. At precisely 4:00, my father and Alan arrived. Daniel greeted them cordially, offered them seats and coffee, playing the role of potential savior perfectly. I sat quietly in the corner, observing. Margaret says you might be willing to help us, my father began. Daniel leaned back in his chair. I might. But first, I need to understand exactly what happened. It's complicated, Alan hedged. I'm sure it is. But if I'm going to put my reputation on the line, I need details. Specifically about the Millfield contracts. My father glanced at me, then back at Daniel. We had an arrangement with Councilman Davis. He ensured we got the contracts for the municipal building renovations. In exchange, we hired his brother's company as a subcontractor. At inflated rates, Daniel supplied. Alan nodded. Triple the going rate. But it was worth it for the overall contract value. And the falsified bids? My father sighed. Davis told us what our competitors were bidding. We came in just under them. I see. Daniel made a note. And the kickbacks? Cash payments, Alan said. Through a shell company we set up in Alan Jr.'s name. Your son? Daniel raised an eyebrow. You involved your son in this? Alan shifted uncomfortably. He's 25. Just on paper. He didn't know the details. I thought of Alan Jr., my entitled nephew, who'd once told me nursing was for people who couldn't hack medical school. The irony of him being an unwitting accomplice was almost poetic. And this has been going on for how long? Daniel asked. The Millfield contracts? About 3 years, my father said. But similar arrangements for other projects longer. How much longer? My father wouldn't meet his eyes. Since before your marriage to Margaret, the room seemed to grow colder. More than a decade of fraud. While I'd been struggling to build my life, working night shifts and double shifts, they'd been stealing and cheating their way to wealth. Daniel continued asking questions, skillfully getting them to detail every aspect of their scheme. When they'd thoroughly incriminated themselves, he sat back. I think I have enough to work with, he said. There are a few calls I can make. My father sagged with relief. Whatever your fee is. We'll discuss that later, Daniel interrupted. But first, there's something you should know. He pressed a button on his desk phone. The door opened, and a woman in a dark suit entered.
Franklin Porter?
Alan Porter? I'm Special Agent Kathleen Mercer, FBI. You're both under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and violation of federal contracting regulations. The color drained from my father's face as 2 more agents entered. What is this? Margaret? I stood up. This is consequences, Dad. As the agents read them their rights and handcuffed them, Alan lunged toward me, only to be restrained. You set us up? Your own family? I'm not part of this family anymore. I repeated my words from a week earlier. Remember? They were let out through a side door to avoid the press. Agent Mercer stayed behind. Thank you, Ms. Wilson. Your cooperation has been invaluable. The recording today, combined with the documentation you provided from their company files, gives us an airtight case. After she left, Daniel poured 2 glasses of scotch. You okay? I accepted the glass, staring at the amber liquid. I'm not sure what I am. You're free, he said simply. That's something. The story broke on all local channels that evening. By morning, it had hit the national news. Construction magnate and son arrested in federal fraud case.
Porter Construction S stock plummeted.
Clients backed out of contracts. The empire my father had built began crumbling in real time. I took a week off work and drove to the lake house in Palmer Cove, my lake house now. The small town hadn't changed much in the years since I'd last visited. The same diner on Main Street. The same bait shop by the marina. The same sense of peace that had made it my mother's favorite place. The house needed work. Dust covers on furniture, cobwebs in corners. My father had kept it, but rarely used it after Mom died. Too many memories, perhaps. I spent the first day cleaning, opening windows to let in fresh air, making the space mine. On the 3rd day, Alan's wife, Charlotte, called. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out. How could you do this to us? She demanded without greeting. The press is camped outside our house. The kids are devastated. Your own family, Maggie. Hello to you too, Charlotte. Tell me, does Alan Jr. know his name is on a shell company used for money laundering? She went silent for a moment. That's different. He didn't know. Ignorance isn't a defense the FBI typically accepts. But maybe if he cooperates. Are you threatening my son now? Her voice rose an octave. I'm giving you advice. Something no one in this family ever bothered to give me. I paused. Alan and Dad used us all, Charlotte. You, me, the kids. We were just props in their empire. The sooner you accept that, the sooner you can start over. I ended the call and walked down to the dock, sitting with my feet dangling above the clear water. My phone rang again. Daniel this time. Your father wants to make a deal, he said. Full cooperation in exchange for leniency. Throwing Alan under the bus. More like throwing Councilman Davis and several other officials under the bus. But yes, he's offering evidence that Alan managed the day-to-day of the scheme. I watched a heron glide across the lake. What will happen to Dad? Probably house arrest given his age. Forfeiture of most assets. The company is finished either way. And Alan? 2 to 5 years if they accept the deal. Less if he cooperates too. I considered this. So they both walk away with something. Justice isn't perfect, Maggie. But they'll never have what they had before. Their reputation, their power, their money. It's gone. After we hung up, I walked along the shoreline, remembering summers here with Mom. Her teaching me to swim in the cove. Reading books on the screened porch during thunderstorms. Making blueberry pancakes in the small kitchen. This was the inheritance that mattered. Not Porter Construction or the family name, but the peace she'd found here and tried to share with me. My phone buzzed with a text from Diane. Saw the news. You okay? I typed back. Getting there. At the lake house for a while. Alone? I smiled.
For now.
Daniel might drive up this weekend. Oh, really? The plot thickens. I put the phone away and continued walking. Daniel and I weren't back together. Not yet, maybe not ever. But the possibility existed, which was more than I'd had before. As the sun began to set, painting the water in golds and pinks, I thought about what came next. I had 2 weeks of vacation time saved up. The lake house needed a new dock, some landscaping work, fresh paint. I could start there. After that, I wasn't sure. But for the first time in years, I felt like I had choices, real ones, not just the scraps left after my father and brother took what they wanted. That night, I slept in my mother's old room, windows open to the lake breeze. I dreamed of her standing on the dock, smiling at me, proud. When I woke, I made coffee and sat on the porch, watching the morning mist rise off the water. My phone showed 3 missed calls from unknown numbers, probably reporters. The story would die down eventually. Some new scandal would take its place. The Porters would become a cautionary tale, then a footnote, then forgotten. But I would still be here, building something new from the wreckage they'd left behind. Not an empire, but a life. My life, finally. I wasn't part of that family anymore. I was something better. I was my own person. And for the first time, that felt like enough.